Dorothy Freeman closed the freight ledger and refused to sign. 3 Cedar Bluff cattle shipments had lost nearly the same share of their weight on paper, and the buyer standing across from her wanted the numbers left alone. Then Clark Benton ducked beneath the office doorway. The room went quiet. The towering cowboy had a reputation that made men give him space. But Clark never raised his voice. He simply laid his worn receipts beside Dorothy's figures and said, "Check them." Dorothy did. Someone was bleeding his ranch a few pounds at a time, and telling the truth could cost her the only job she had. "Stay with Dorothy and Clark, and tell me, would you have signed the ledger?" Dorothy Freeman found the first missing weight on a Thursday afternoon. Granite Hollow had gone quiet under the late May sun. Dust lay pale across the boardwalk outside Earl Whitaker's freight office, and through the open window came the slow creak of a wagon turning toward the general store. Somewhere down the street, a hammer struck iron at the blacksmith shop. Dorothy heard all of it without looking up. Her finger moved down a column of figures in the freight ledger. 112 head. Recorded weight at Cedar Bluff, 103,140 pounds. Weight entered for settlement, 96,160. She stopped. Dorothy sharpened her pencil with a small pocket knife, brushed the shavings into her palm, and checked the arithmetic again. Then she pulled another receipt from the wooden tray beside her. Different month. Different number of cattle. Nearly the same percentage missing. A third receipt gave her the same answer. Dorothy laid all 3 side by side. She had been in Granite Hollow 6 days, long enough to know that Earl Whitaker liked his coffee black, kept the office key beneath the second flower pot, and became impatient whenever paperwork delayed a cattle buyer. Not long enough to accuse anyone of anything. So she didn't. She drew one small pencil mark beside each total. The front door opened. Earl came in carrying a stack of invoices under one arm. "You still on Benton's account?" Dorothy nodded. "There's the discrepancy. There usually is with cattle. Not like this." Earl dropped the invoices on his desk. "Trail shrinkage. Happens every drive." Dorothy turned the 3 receipts toward him. "Then the cattle at Cedar Bluff have a remarkable habit." Earl frowned. "They lose almost the same proportion every time." His eyes moved over the papers, only for a second. That second interested Dorothy more than anything he said afterward. "Nothing remarkable about it. Heat, water, distance. Animals don't arrive weighing what they did when they left." "I know." "Then enter the settlement figure." Dorothy looked at the blank line waiting for her signature. "I'd rather reconcile it first." Earl's mouth tightened. Before he could answer, footsteps sounded on the boardwalk. The conversation near the front window stopped. A rancher Dorothy had seen twice that week quietly moved his chair farther from the door. Then Clark Benton stepped inside. He had to lower his head beneath the frame. He was not enormous in the impossible way stories later made men enormous. He was simply a very tall man, perhaps 6.5 feet, made broader by years of lifting saddles, setting posts, pulling calves and working cattle from before sunrise until there was no light left to work by. Dust covered his coat almost to the elbows. A leather glove was tucked through his belt. His face carried the red-brown weathering of a man who spent more time outdoors than under a roof. Dorothy noticed something else. He noticed the chair being moved. His eyes touched it once. Then he removed his hat. He did not come closer to her desk. "Whitaker." "Benton." Clark reached inside his coat and produced 3 folded receipts. "I want these checked." Earl gave a short laugh. "Again?" "Again." Earl gestured toward Dorothy. "Mrs. Freeman's already got herself tangled up in your weights." "Miss Freeman," Dorothy corrected. Clark looked at her. Not long enough to be rude, long enough to remember it. "Can you check them?" "I can." She held out her hand. Clark crossed half the room, placed the papers on the edge of the desk, then stepped back. Dorothy unfolded them. The silence changed while she worked. She could feel Earl waiting for her to reach the answer he wanted. She could feel Clark waiting for an answer, period. The difference mattered. She compared Clark's ranch tally with the freight settlement. Then the second. Then the third. These match the office copies, she said. Earl exhaled through his nose. There, settled. No. Dorothy placed the papers in 2 rows. These figures match because the office copies were entered from the settlement figures. Mr. Benton's ranch tally gives the weights before shipment. The difference is too consistent. Earl's jaw hardened. Miss Freeman, you've been here less than a week. The arithmetic has been here longer. Clark's eyes shifted toward her. Something almost changed in his expression. Almost. The door opened again. Milton Graves entered wearing a clean gray coat despite the dust outside. He was 44, neatly shaved, with polished boots and the easy smile of a man who preferred other people to believe every conversation had already ended in his favor. Benton. Clark put his hat beneath one arm. Graves. Milton noticed the receipts. Still worrying those numbers? Dorothy looked from one man to the other. Milton walked toward the desk. Cattle lose weight. Everybody knows it. Dorothy tapped the first receipt. 7,080 pounds. Then the second. 6,420. Then the third. Different drives, different herd sizes, similar loss by percentage. Milton's smile remained. What are you suggesting? I haven't suggested anything. Good. He placed 2 fingers lightly on the ledger. Best not to turn bookkeeping errors into something larger than they are. Dorothy looked at his hand, then at him. She closed the ledger. The sound was not loud. In the quiet office, it might as well have been a gunshot. I won't sign the entry until it balances. Earl stared at her. Milton withdrew his hand. Clark said nothing. That was what Dorothy remembered later. He could have used the moment to threaten Earl. He could have leaned across the desk and made use of the reputation that had caused a grown man to move his chair. Instead, Clark took his receipts. Let her check it. Milton's smile finally weakened. Clark put his hat on and left. 3 days later, Dorothy lost her job. Earl waited until Saturday afternoon. He counted half a month's wages onto the desk, coin by coin, without meeting her eyes. Business has slowed. Dorothy looked through the window. 2 wagons were waiting outside. I see. Nothing personal. I didn't think it was. She put the money into the small cloth purse inside her bag. Earl cleared his throat. You're good with figures. Dorothy closed the clasp. That appears to be the problem. She walked out before he could answer. Granite Hollow's main street was bright enough to make her squint. Trudda stood at the rail outside Louise Harper's general store. Beyond the rooftops, the Wind River foothills rose blue-gray against the western sky, streaked with the last snow of spring. Dorothy had come from Kansas because she wanted work that belonged to her. 6 days later, she was counting the money required to leave. Louise Harper stood behind the store counter when Dorothy asked about the eastbound stage. Monday morning, Louise said. Weather permitting. Dorothy nodded. Then I'll need the room 2 more nights. You can have it. Louise glanced past her toward the window, though you may want to wait before buying your fare. Dorothy turned. Clark Benton was tying a bay gelding to the hitching rail. He entered carrying none of the uneasiness the town seemed determined to carry for him. Mr. Freeman, Mr. Benton, I heard Whitaker let you go. Granite Hollow works quickly. Not much else to do in town. It was the closest thing to humor she had heard from him. Dorothy waited. Clark looked toward the shelves of coffee and flour, then back at her. If I pay you properly for the work, will you audit Cedar Bluff's books? Dorothy studied him. Why me? You found something Whitaker didn't want found. That doesn't mean I can prove what it is. No. His answer came without disappointment. It means you'll tell me if you can't. Dorothy's fingers rested on the handle of her bag. How many years of records? 4 on hand. More in storage. How many cattle last year? Just under 300 head moved through sales and shipments. Debts? A pause. Some. Mortgages? Another pause. 1. Dorothy noticed it. Clark noticed that she noticed. If I do this, she said, I see every transaction involving the cattle. Purchases, sales, freight charges, loans, feed, wages, everything. Clark's face went still. That's a lot to ask. You're asking me to tell you where your money went. He looked through the front window toward the mountains, then back at her. All right. Dorothy did not offer her hand. I'm working for wages, not favors. I know. And if you decide you don't like what I find, I still get paid. You will. Louise pretended to straighten a row of canned peaches. Dorothy picked up her bag. When do we start? Clark opened the door. Now! Cedar Bluff Ranch lay several miles beyond Dry Willow Creek, where the road narrowed and climbed through open grassland, broken by sage and low stands of cottonwood. Dorothy rode the spare mare Clark had brought while he kept several horse lengths ahead, slowing at washed places without telling her how to ride them. By late afternoon, Cedar Bluff appeared beneath a long sandstone rise. The house was plain and weather-darkened. A barn stood beyond it, with a corral, windmill, bunkhouse, and several stretches of fence running toward grazing country. Nothing about it looked rich. Everything looked used. Peter Nolan came from the barn carrying a coil of rope. He looked first at Clark, then Dorothy, then the bag tied behind her saddle. This the bookkeeper? Dorothy Freeman, Clark said. Peter gave a doubtful nod. Dorothy returned it. Clark led her into a small room off the kitchen. A desk stood beneath the window. 2 ledgers occupied one shelf. Receipts had been tied into bundles with cotton string and marked by year. Dorothy removed her gloves. When was the last full audit? Clark leaned against the doorframe, then seemed to realize how completely his shoulders filled it. He stepped aside. My father kept most of it until he died. I've kept enough since. Enough isn't a number. No, Dorothy sat. Then we'd better find one. For the next 2 hours, she worked while the light moved across the desk. Clark came once with coffee in a tin cup. He set it beside her without interrupting. By sunset, she had reconstructed the first year. She started the second, then stopped. A freight deduction from August, another in October, another the following spring. Dorothy pulled the recent receipts from her bag and laid them beside the older entries. Same buyer, same forwarding office, same kind of weight loss. Her pencil stopped above the page. Clark had returned without her hearing him. What? Dorothy counted once more. Then she turned the ledger toward him. This didn't start this spring. Clark came closer. How far? At least 2 years. The ranch yard outside had gone quiet except for a windmill turning in the evening breeze. Dorothy pointed to one shipment, then another, then another. Every one of these settlements came in lower than the ranch tally says it should have. Not by the same number of pounds, by nearly the same proportion. Clark stared at the page. How much? I don't know yet. Guess. I don't guess with other people's money. His eyes lifted to hers. For the first time since Granite Hollow, Dorothy saw something beneath his stillness. Not anger, fear. She turned another page. If these entries are accurate, Mr. Benton, Cedar Bluff hasn't simply been having bad years. Outside, a cow called from the lower pasture. Dorothy rested her pencil beside the ledger. Someone has been taking a little from this ranch every time your cattle leave it. Clark looked toward the darkening window, then back at the 2 years of figures between them. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to call a bookkeeping error. For the next 9 days, Dorothy rode from Granite Hollow to Cedar Bluff every morning and back again before dark. Louise Harper rented her the small room above the general store. It held an iron bed, a washstand, one narrow window, and a pitcher that rattled whenever a freight wagon passed below. Dorothy paid by the week and kept her money folded inside an envelope beneath the lining of her leather bag. She liked knowing exactly what belonged to her. The trouble was the road. Cedar Bluff lay far enough from town that the round trip consumed hours she needed for the books. Spring rain had softened the low crossing at Dry Willow Creek, and twice Dorothy had to dismount and lead her mare around wheel ruts deep enough to catch a hoof. She began leaving before 7. Some evenings she returned after the lamps were lit. By the second week, people noticed. Peter Nolan was the one who finally said it aloud. He and Clark were repairing a gate when Dorothy came from the ranch office carrying a bundle of receipts. "Folks in town got plenty to say about a woman riding out here every morning," Peter said. Dorothy stopped. Peter's face changed when he realized she had heard him. "I wasn't saying I agreed with them." "No," Dorothy said. "You were only making sure Mr. Benton knew." Clark drove the staple he was holding into the post. One strike, then another. "That's enough, Peter." Peter picked up the fencing pliers and walked toward the corral. Dorothy watched him go. "Is he wrong?" Clark rested the hammer against his thigh. "No." That irritated her more than a comforting lie would have. By then she had traced 18 questionable settlements through Cedar Bluff's records. Some differences were small. Others were large enough to cover several months of a ranch hand's wages. But there were still gaps, receipts missing, loan figures without supporting papers, payments marked only with Clark's father's initials. Dorothy needed time. Instead, she was spending nearly 3 hours a day on horseback. That evening, Clark rode toward an abandoned line cabin north of Dry Willow Creek. Dorothy went with him. The cabin had once housed a married ranch hand. Now one shutter hung crooked. Rain had stained the ceiling, and a section of floor near the stove sagged beneath Clark's boot. He crouched and pressed 2 fingers against the wood. Rot. Dorothy looked at the dark clouds collecting above the foothills. "How long to repair it?" "Roof first, floor. Chimney needs pointing." "So not tomorrow." Clark stood. "No." On the ride back, neither spoke until Cedar Bluff's windmill appeared above the rise. Clark finally said, "There's another way." Dorothy waited. Marriage would stop the talk. Her mare took 3 more steps before Dorothy pulled the reins. Clark stopped as well. She looked at him, and started a different kind. "I expect it would." "You're serious?" "Yes." Dorothy studied his face for some sign that this was a joke badly told. There wasn't one. Clark shifted in the saddle. "I have a house. You need to be close to the records. You'd have your own room." "That sounds like hiring a resident clerk." "It could be. Except for the marriage?" "Yes. And what exactly would you expect from a wife?" Clark's eyes moved toward the distant ranch. "Nothing you didn't agree to." That answer made her quiet. He continued. "You'd keep your wages. What you own stays yours. What I own stays mine. Separate rooms. If you want out after a year, I won't stop you." Dorothy's expression sharpened. "No romance?" "No." "You sound relieved about that." Clark looked straight at her. "I don't need romance." Dorothy turned her mare toward the ranch. "Then this isn't an offer until I get to name my terms." Clark followed. "All right." She glanced at him. "You don't know my terms." "No." "Yet you're agreeing to hear them?" "Yes." For some reason that mattered. 2 days later, they sat at a table in the back of Louise Harper's store, with a sheet of foolscap between them. Louise served as one witness. Peter, uncomfortable in a clean shirt, served as the other. Dorothy had written the agreement herself. Her wages remained hers. Her savings remained hers. Her personal records could not be taken or opened by Clark without permission. Any property either brought into the marriage remained separately recognized. If the arrangement ended, Dorothy would receive every dollar of unpaid wages and retain what she had earned. Neither would incur a private debt in the other's name. Clark read the page slowly. At the bottom, Dorothy had added one final sentence. Either party could end the arrangement after 1 year without a claim of repayment for ordinary household support. Clark tapped the line. "You thought of everything. I've had practice thinking about what happens when other people control the roof over my head." He looked at her then. Dorothy lowered her eyes to the paper. She had said more than she intended. Clark did not ask for the rest. He picked up the pen. Signed. The wedding took place the following afternoon in a small room at the county clerk's office in Granite Hollow. There were no flowers. Louise wore her best brown dress and brought a sprig of wild sage anyway. Peter stood beside the door with his hat turning slowly in his hands. When the clerk asked Clark whether he took Dorothy Freeman as his wife, Clark said, "I do." Nothing more. Dorothy said the same. The clerk recorded the marriage. Clark paid the fee. Then they walked outside into a Wyoming afternoon bright with wind and dust. Dorothy looked down at the plain paper in her hand. Mrs. Benton, legally. Yet Clark was already loading her bag into the wagon as carefully as if the agreement they had signed mattered more than the marriage certificate. Perhaps, for now, it did. At Cedar Bluff, he gave her the bedroom at the east end of the hall. His was at the opposite end. The first evening passed with almost awkward politeness. Dorothy cooked because she was hungry, not because anyone told her to. Clark washed his own plate afterward. He left before sunrise the next morning. She returned to the ledgers. Marriage changed remarkably little. Until Dorothy asked for the second key. She had already gone through the books in the kitchen office, but several entries referred to documents stored in the small room beside Clark's bedroom. That door remained locked. At supper, she asked about it. "My father's papers," Clark said. "I need them. Some have nothing to do with the ranch." "Then I'll leave those alone." Clark continued cutting his meat. "You have everything you need downstairs." "No, I have everything you've decided I need." His knife stopped. Dorothy did not raise her voice. "You asked me to find where Cedar Bluff's money went." "I did. And I told you my condition." "I remember." "Then why is there still a locked door?" Clark looked toward the hallway. "Those papers were my father's. And those cattle were his before they were yours." Silence settled over the kitchen. The clock on the shelf ticked twice. Clark stood. For a moment, Dorothy wondered whether she had finally found the temper Granite Hollow talked about. He walked outside instead. A few minutes later came the heavy sound of an axe striking wood. Once, again. Then a third blow that ended with a dull crack. Peter, crossing from the bunkhouse, stopped when he saw the axe buried deep in the chopping block. Clark pulled at it once. It did not move. Peter waited. Clark's shoulders rose with one breath, then fell. He left the axe where it was, picked up his coat, and walked toward the north fence. Peter watched him go. Inside, Dorothy closed the ledger. She did no more work that afternoon. At supper, Clark's chair remained empty. Dorothy ate alone. She had nearly finished when the back door opened. Clark came in carrying the smell of cold air and horse leather. He washed his hands at the basin. Then he crossed the room. Something small touched the table beside Dorothy's bowl. A key. Dorothy looked at it. Clark remained standing. "If you're keeping the truth," he said, "you need all of it." There was no apology, but there was no excuse either. Dorothy picked up the key. "Thank you." Clark nodded once. That night she unlocked the room. The air inside smelled of old paper, leather, and dust. A narrow desk stood against the wall. Boxes were stacked beneath it. Clark's father's coat still hung from a peg, its shoulders collapsed inward with age. Dorothy did not touch the personal letters. She opened only boxes marked with ranch years. Within an hour, she found the mortgage note. Cedar Bluff had borrowed against part of its property during a bad winter several years earlier. Payments had been made, but the remaining balance was larger than Dorothy expected. She copied it carefully. Then she found the freight receipts. Some matched the downstairs ledger, others did not. Dorothy carried 4 to the desk beneath the lamp. 3 bore the stamp associated with Milton Graves's purchases. She arranged them by date. June, September, April, then the 4th. Dorothy frowned. She read the date again. Clark's father had died in February of that year. The ranch ledger made that clear. Funeral costs appeared in Clark's own handwriting. But this receipt was dated May, 3 months later. At the bottom was an authorization entered under his father's name. Dorothy sat completely still. A floorboard sounded in the hall. Clark appeared in the doorway but did not enter. "Find something?" Dorothy turned the receipt toward the lamplight. "When did your father die?" Clark's face changed. "You've seen the date. I want to hear you say it." "February 17th. Dorothy looked down. The receipt was dated May 23rd. Clark stepped closer. She handed it to him. He read the authorization once, then again. The big hand holding the paper became perfectly still. "My father couldn't have approved this." "No." "Could it be copied from an older form?" "It could." Dorothy looked at the other 3 receipts. "But somebody still used it." Clark lifted his eyes. The house around them was silent. Dorothy had begun this work looking for missing cattle weight. Now she was holding a transaction authorized by a dead man. And for the first time, the locked room no longer felt like Clark Benton's secret. It felt like someone else's. By the middle of June, Dorothy had learned that Clark Benton was easier to understand when she stopped waiting for him to explain himself. He rarely did. The ranch settled into summer around them. Mornings came cool off the Wind River foothills, but by noon, the grass had turned bright under a hard blue sky. Dust collected on the porch boards. Dry Willow Creek narrowed between its cottonwoods. The cattle moved toward shade earlier each afternoon. Dorothy spent most evenings at the kitchen table with ledgers spread around her. One night, she stood after 3 hours of work and pressed a hand against her lower back. The chair was too low. She said nothing about it. The following morning, it was gone. Dorothy found another chair beside the table and assumed Peter had broken the first one. That evening, Clark carried it through the back door. The front legs had been lengthened. A new support had been fitted beneath the seat, and the loose back rail no longer moved. He set it in its old place. Dorothy looked at him. "You repaired my chair. It needed fixing." "It needed fixing yesterday, too." Clark went to the stove and poured coffee. Dorothy sat down. Her elbows now rested naturally above the ledger. "Exactly right." She looked toward him. Clark was studying his coffee as though it required his complete attention. The next morning, he rode out before sunrise. When he returned after checking the cattle along Dry Willow Creek, a tin cup was waiting beside the stove. The coffee was still warm. Clark looked at Dorothy. She continued adding a column. Neither mentioned the chair. Neither mentioned the coffee. Something in the house had changed anyway. A week later, a cattle buyer came to inspect 32 steers Clark intended to sell before the autumn shipment. Dorothy stood beside the corral with the tally sheet. The buyer counted the cattle, then turned to Clark. 29. Dorothy looked down. 32. The buyer ignored her. 29 sound right to you, Benton? Clark leaned against the fence. Dorothy counted again. 32. The buyer gave Clark an impatient look. You selling cattle, or is she? Clark straightened. For a man his size, the movement was enough to make the buyer take half a step back. Clark did not move toward him. He moved away. One step, leaving Dorothy between the two men with the tally sheet in her hand. She's got the count. The buyer looked at Dorothy then. Really looked. She held out the tally. 32 steers. You can count them again if you want. He did. There were 32. Peter Nolan watched from the gate. Later, when Dorothy passed him carrying the paperwork, he opened the gate before she reached it. Mrs. Benton. It was the first time he had called her anything but the bookkeeper. Dorothy noticed. She kept walking. The investigation moved beyond Cedar Bluff soon after. 2 neighboring ranches had freight settlements Dorothy wanted to compare. She rode to one on a Wednesday and another that Friday, carrying no accusations, only dates and receipt numbers. What she found was worse than she expected. The same buyer appeared repeatedly. Milton Graves, the same forwarding office, Earl Whitaker's, the same pattern of cattle arriving lighter on paper than ranch tallies suggested they should have. One rancher had borrowed against his next calf crop after a poor settlement. Months later, Graves bought part of his herd at a reduced price. Another had given up a grazing lease after falling behind. Graves acquired access to it before winter. Dorothy returned to Cedar Bluff near dusk, with dust gray on the hem of her skirt. Clark was unsaddling his horse. How many? 6 ranches, counting yours? His hands stopped on the cinch. You're sure? I'm sure about the pattern. Can you prove it? Not yet. Clark resumed working. What do you need? The original scale book. Whitaker's? Yes. That'll be difficult. Difficult isn't the same as impossible. A corner of Clark's mouth moved. Dorothy saw it. He turned before she could decide whether it had been a smile. That night she brought a small packet of papers from her room. She had avoided doing it for weeks. Now there was no way around it. Clark came into the kitchen while she was arranging the pages. He removed his gloves. What are those? Dorothy didn't answer immediately. That was enough. Clark came closer. The pages were handwritten copies of entries from Whitaker's office. Not Cedar Bluff alone, several ranches. His eyes moved from the papers to Dorothy. Where did you get these? I copied them. When? Before Earl dismissed me. Clark stared at her. You had these the whole time. I had some of them. You kept that from me. Dorothy's shoulders stiffened. I didn't know you well enough to hand you the only proof I had. Clark looked at the papers, then at the office key lying near Dorothy's elbow. You made me open my father's room. Yes. You said no hidden pages. And you think that meant I owed you everything I possessed the moment we signed a marriage paper? No. His answer came too quickly. Dorothy stood. Then what exactly are you angry about? Clark opened his mouth. Nothing came. His jaw tightened. For one moment, the old stories about him seemed possible. The fight in Granite Hollow years earlier, the temper people whispered about whenever he entered a room. His hand closed around the back of the repaired chair, then loosened. He stepped away from it. I need air. Clark took his coat and went outside. That night he slept in the bunkhouse. Dorothy knew because his bedroom lamp never came on. The next morning his coffee cup remained where she had left it, cold. For 2 days they spoke only about ranch work. Then a young hand named Samuel lost control of a nervous mare near the corral. The cinch had slipped. The saddle rolled. Samuel caught a boot awkwardly, and the frightened horse pulled him several yards before he worked free. Clark was closest. Dorothy saw him reach the mare. A stronger man might have tried to overpower the animal. Clark didn't. He took hold of the rein and moved with her. Easy. The mare jerked her head. Clark gave her room. Easy now. His voice stayed low. Step by step, the horse slowed. Only then did Clark take her bridle. He checked Samuel, sent Peter for water, then stood quietly beside the mare until her trembling stopped. Dorothy watched from the porch. That evening, Clark returned to the house. They ate in silence. Afterward, Dorothy carried her coffee outside. Clark was already sitting at one end of the porch. She chose the other. Dark clouds had gathered over the mountains. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Dorothy asked, "Who taught you to expect people to leave?" Clark's head turned. She kept looking toward the pasture. He could have refused. Instead, he placed his cup on the porch rail. Alice Monroe. Dorothy waited. "I was going to marry her." Clark rubbed a thumb along an old mark in the wood. "We had drought that year, then an early freeze, lost cattle, owed money on feed, owed more on the ranch." The first drops of rain touched the yard. Alice stayed through part of it. Then one morning, she told me she couldn't spend her life wondering whether winter would take the roof. Was she cruel? No. Did she lie to you? No. Clark looked into the dark. She left. That was the wound. Not betrayal, departure. I didn't go after her. Why? I figured if someone wants the road, standing in front of it won't make them stay. Dorothy held her cup between both hands. And after that? I stopped asking. Rain began ticking against the porch roof. Dorothy understood the marriage proposal differently now. Clark had not wanted a wife without love because he thought love was foolish. He wanted one because a practical arrangement seemed less dangerous. Dorothy looked down at her hands. My mother died when I was young. Clark said nothing. I lived with relatives after that. 2 different houses. She paused. They weren't bad people. The distinction mattered to her. They fed me, gave me a bed, expected me to help. Fair enough. The rain strengthened. But every disagreement ended the same way. Clark waited. Dorothy spoke the words quietly. As long as you're under my roof. Her fingers tightened around the cup. You hear that enough, you learn something. The person who owns the roof owns the last word. Clark looked at her. So I learned to keep money where I could reach it. I learned to know the stage schedule. I learned not to let anyone become the only door I had. The space between them seemed smaller now, though neither had moved. Clark feared an open door because someone might walk through it. Dorothy feared a locked one because someday she might need to. The rain came harder, blowing silver beyond the porch. After a while, Clark said, I was wrong about the copies. Dorothy turned. He did not look away. You had a reason. I should have told you sooner. Maybe. A pause. Maybe I should have given you the key sooner. Dorothy almost smiled. Maybe. They stayed there while rain moved across Cedar Bluff. No touch, no promise. But when Dorothy went inside, Clark followed a few minutes later. The next morning, a rider came up the road shortly after breakfast. He carried a railroad envelope. Peter brought it into the kitchen. From the siding. Clark broke the seal. Dorothy watched his eyes move across the notice, then stop. What? He handed it to her. Cedar Bluff's autumn shipment would not be accepted for loading until an outstanding freight obligation was settled. Dorothy read the amount, then the date. She went immediately to the ledger. Clark followed. She opened to the relevant month. Nothing. She checked the freight bundle. Nothing. Then the weekly reconciliation she had completed only days earlier. Still nothing. Clark stood across from her. You missed it? Dorothy looked up sharply. Then she saw his face. He wasn't accusing her. He was asking because he needed the answer. No. She pulled the notice beside the ledger. This debt wasn't here. When? Last week. You're certain? Dorothy placed one finger on the reconciliation total. I signed this 7 days ago. Outside, Peter was calling cattle through the lower gate. The autumn shipment was already being planned. Men had been hired. Feed had been purchased. Rail space had been arranged. Miss that window. and Cedar Bluff would carry too many cattle into winter. Dorothy read the notice once more. The debt had not been forgotten. It had not been overlooked. Someone had added it. And whoever had done it had waited until Cedar Bluff had the most to lose. By the first week of September, the cattle were gathered in the south pasture. 247 head. Dorothy knew the number because she had counted them twice against Peter Nolan's tally, then written it in ink across the shipment page. Clark knew the number because he had spent most of the summer keeping those cattle alive. The grass had gone yellow across Cedar Bluff. Dry Willow Creek had dropped low enough that stones showed through the water. Each morning carried a little more cold down from the Wind River country. Winter was no longer something far away. It was coming, and Cedar Bluff needed that shipment to move. The disputed freight debts stood in the way. Dorothy had written Earl Whitaker twice requesting the original account entry. No answer. Clark sent Peter into Granite Hollow. Peter returned with the same message. Pay first, dispute later. On Thursday morning, Clark saddled his horse. Peter saw him and began tightening the cinch on his own. 2 other hands moved toward the corral. Dorothy came out carrying the railroad notice. Where are you going? Whitaker's office. With Peter and 2 men? Clark looked toward the road. I've asked politely. And when 4 cowboys walk into his office behind you, what do you think Earl will remember? Clark's eyes came back to her. Dorothy stepped off the porch. He won't remember the false entry. He won't remember the receipt numbers. He'll remember Clark Benton came into town angry. Peter stopped working on his saddle. Dorothy held up the notice. If you walk into that office angry, they'll stop talking about numbers and start talking about you. Clark's hand closed around the saddle horn. The leather creaked. Dorothy saw his knuckles pale. Nobody moved. Then Clark released it. He looked at Peter. Unsaddle. Peter hesitated only a second. Clark turned to Dorothy. Then you go. She did. Granite Hollow smelled of dust, coal smoke, and horses by the time Dorothy reached Whitaker's office. Earl was not there. Milton Graves was. He sat in the chair beside Earl's desk as comfortably as if the office belonged to him. You came about Cedar Bluff. Dorothy remained standing. You knew I would. Milton smiled. I knew Benton couldn't afford not to. He slid a paper across the desk. An offer for the cattle. Dorothy read the total once. It was enough to cover wages, some feed, and part of the mortgage payment. Not enough to leave Cedar Bluff strong enough for winter. You're buying distressed cattle at a discount. I'm offering cash to a ranch with a freight problem. A freight problem that appeared last week. Milton's smile faded slightly. Careful. Dorothy folded the offer and put it back on the desk. With what? Conclusions. I prefer arithmetic. Milton leaned back. You think those copies of yours prove something? Dorothy said nothing. That told him enough. He studied her for a moment. Then his voice changed. Less sharp, almost reasonable. You came west to work, didn't you? Yes. To build something for yourself. Dorothy's expression remained still. There is an office in Cheyenne that needs someone who can keep livestock accounts. Better pay than Whitaker gave you. Regular hours, a room nearby. Dorothy understood. What do I have to do? Nothing. Milton smiled again. That's the point. She waited. Don't involve yourself in a county dispute. Don't turn up at any hearing with copies nobody can verify. Let Benton settle his business. And you arrange Cheyenne. I can make an introduction. Dorothy looked through the dusty window toward the street. Milton continued. Cedar Bluff may fail even if you're right. That landed closer than she wanted it to. Winter doesn't care about ledgers. Neither does a bank. Dorothy faced him. You came west to own your own life. Why tie it to his? For a moment she heard rain against the Cedar Bluff porch. As long as you're under my roof. Different voice, different house, same old fear. Dorothy picked up her gloves. I haven't decided what my life is tied to. Milton nodded. Then decide before the cattle miss their rail date. She left. Clark was in the ranch office when she returned after sunset. One lamp burned on the desk. He did not ask what Milton had said. Dorothy removed her hat. You know. Peter heard enough in town. Milton offered me work in Cheyenne. Clark's face did not change. He offered an introduction, and I didn't answer him. Clark looked down at the papers before him. Dorothy recognized one immediately. Their marriage agreement. Beside it sat an envelope. Clark pushed both toward her. Your wages through Saturday. Dorothy didn't touch them. There are $2 more for the days you spent riding to the other ranches. I should have counted those as work. Clark. He placed several coins beside the envelope. Stage fare. The room seemed to become very quiet. Dorothy looked at the agreement. A second sheet had been added beneath it. It stated that Clark Benton made no claim against Dorothy Freeman Benton for wages, property, savings, or ordinary support received during their arrangement, and that anything she had brought or earned remained hers. Dorothy read it twice. You prepared this today? Yes. You want me to leave? Clark looked at her. For once, the answer did not come quickly. No. The single word sat between them. Then he added, wanting isn't the same as owning. Dorothy's hand moved to the back of the repaired chair. Clark looked away first. If you go, nobody gets to say you left owing me. What about the ranch? I'll deal with it. How? I don't know yet. You could lose half your breeding stock. I know. Then why are you giving me stage fare? His jaw shifted. Because you shouldn't have to stay just because I need you. Dorothy looked at the man Granite Hollow considered dangerous. He stood on the other side of a desk and handed her the means to leave him. No raised voice. No demand. No promise that everything would be fine if she stayed. Just an open road. Dorothy picked up the agreement. Her fingers brushed the edge of the envelope. Clark stepped back. That small movement hurt more than if he had reached for her. She gathered the papers. I need to think. Clark nodded. Take the time. They did not sit on the porch that night. Dorothy did not leave coffee beside the stove. Clark did not come downstairs after supper. Near midnight, Dorothy packed her worn leather bag, 2 dresses, her bookkeeping tools, the copied receipts, her savings, the termination paper. She held the ranch office key for a long time, then placed it on the table in her room. Before dawn, Louise Harper's hired driver stopped at Cedar Bluff on his way to meet the eastbound stage. Dorothy carried her own bag outside. The house was dark. She looked once toward Clark's bedroom window. No lamp. She climbed aboard. The wagon rolled away. Clark had been awake. He heard every wheel turn over the yard. He did not go to the window. When morning came, he walked down the hallway. Dorothy's door stood open. The bed was made. The wash basin was empty. Her bag was gone. On the small table lay the office key. Clark stopped at the threshold. He did not enter. For several seconds, his hand rested against the doorframe. Then he reached in only far enough to take the key. He closed the door. Outside, Peter was already gathering the men. The cattle still had to be moved toward the holding pasture near the rail spur, whether the railroad accepted them or not. Peter looked at Clark once. He did not ask where Dorothy was. Clark mounted. "Sir, bring the south herd through the creek crossing before noon." Peter nodded. They went to work. By 8 that morning, Dorothy was aboard the stage leaving Granite Hollow. The town disappeared behind a curtain of pale road dust. She'd sat beside an older woman carrying 2 hat boxes and watched the foothills move slowly past the window. At the first major junction, the driver stopped to water the horses. A weathered sign stood beside the road. Cheyenne pointed north. The county road turned west. Dorothy climbed down with her bag. The driver looked at her. Ma'am, we're headed north. I know. You getting back on? No. The driver glanced at the empty road. Not much here. I only need a horse. There was a small livery beside the way station. Dorothy paid for the hire of a steady chestnut mare. She tied her bag behind the saddle. Inside it were the copied entries Earl Whitaker believed she could not prove. The dead man's authorization, 6 ranch names, receipt numbers, dates, and the agreement Clark had given her because he refused to make Cedar Bluff another locked door. Dorothy mounted. The stage rolled north toward Cheyenne without her. She turned the mare west, toward the county seat. Dorothy reached the county seat shortly before 4 in the afternoon. The mare was sweating beneath the saddle, and dust had worked its way into the seams of Dorothy's gloves. She had stopped only once to water the horse and eat a piece of bread Louise Harper had wrapped for her before dawn. The courthouse stood at the end of a broad dirt street, 2 stories of brick with a wooden staircase worn smooth in the middle. Dorothy carried her bag inside. Judge Calvin Price was preparing to leave. He was 63, silver-haired, narrow-faced, and already wearing his coat when the clerk brought Dorothy into his office. "You're Mrs. Benton?" "Dorothy Freeman Benton." Price glanced at the bag in her hand. "And this concerns Cedar Bluff?" "It concerns more than Cedar Bluff." That stopped him. Dorothy opened the bag. She did not tell him Milton Graves was a thief. She did not tell him Earl Whitaker was corrupt. She laid out dates, receipt numbers, settlement totals, ranch tallies, then the copied entries she had made before Earl dismissed her. Judge Price removed his coat. He sat down again. Dorothy showed him the freight authorization carrying the name of Clark's father 3 months after the man's death. Price read it twice. "Copies aren't originals." "I know. Whitaker can dispute them." "I know that too." "Then what are you asking me for?" Dorothy placed 6 ranch names on the desk. "Don't believe me." Price looked up. "Make them show you the books." Silence held for a moment. Then the judge leaned back. "Can any of these ranchers support what you're saying?" "2 can. Maybe 3 if they'll come." "Where?" "One is south of Granite Hollow. One is west along Willow Road." Price checked the wall clock. "You don't have much time. Neither does Cedar Bluff." By noon the next day, 2 ranchers were sitting outside Price's office with their own receipts folded inside coat pockets. One had driven half the night. The other arrived angry because Dorothy had been right. His settlement total did not match the weight recorded before shipment. That was enough for Price to act. Not enough to declare anyone guilty. Enough to preserve records before they disappeared. A written order went out requiring Earl Whitaker's office to produce the original scale ledger, freight account book, and supporting receipts connected to the disputed shipments. The Cedar Bluff debt was temporarily contested pending examination. Dorothy read the order once. "When does the railroad hear?" "Telegraph goes today." She let out the breath she had been holding. Price gathered the papers. "This isn't finished." "I don't need finished today." "What do you need?" "My husband's cattle loaded." It was the first time she had used the word husband without thinking about the agreement attached to it. Judge Price noticed nothing. Dorothy did. The original books arrived the following morning. Earl came with them. Milton Graves came without being asked. The scale ledger was large, cloth-bound, and worn at the corners. Earl placed it on the courthouse table with the careful indignation of a man offended that anyone had questioned his records. Dorothy stood opposite him. Price opened to the first receipt number. The written figure matched Earl's settlement. Dorothy's stomach tightened. Then Price tilted the page toward the window. Beneath the darker ink was another number. Faint, partly scraped, still visible. Dorothy moved closer. The original figure was higher. They checked another, then another. Not every page had been altered the same way. Some totals had been overwritten. Some deductions appeared in the account book, but not on the original ranch receipts. Then came the authorization bearing the name of Clark's father. Price looked at Earl. "This man was dead by this date?" Dorothy answered. 3 months. Earl's face lost color. "I don't handle every paper personally." Milton spoke from near the window. "Then perhaps your weighmaster made mistakes." Earl turned toward him. "You gave us the settlement instructions." Milton's eyes hardened. Judge Price closed the ledger. "Gentlemen," both stopped. "This office will retain these books." Milton stepped forward. "I have business records in there, and they'll remain business records while this is examined. This proves nothing against me." Price looked at him. "I haven't said it does." That was all. No dramatic arrest, no confession, no handcuffs. Just a courthouse clerk carrying the ledger into another room where neither Earl nor Milton could change it anymore. Sometimes that was how a powerful scheme began to fail. Someone finally took away the eraser. By the time Dorothy rode back toward the railroad spur, Cedar Bluff's cattle had already reached the holding pens. Clark stood beside the loading chute while Peter and the other hands worked the herd forward. He had slept little. The disputed debt still hung over the shipment when they arrived that morning, so Clark had brought the cattle anyway. If the railroad refused them, he would turn them back toward Cedar Bluff. He had no better plan. Then, shortly after noon, the station agent came from the telegraph office holding a yellow message slip. "Benton." Clark took it. The disputed charge had been suspended pending county examination. Shipment authorized. Peter read Clark's face before he heard the words. "We loading?" Clark folded the telegram. "We're loading." The work began. Cattle crowded the wooden lanes. Gates knocked against posts. Men called numbers back and forth, while the locomotive breathed steam along the siding. Clark worked without stopping. But once, when Peter rode past him, he said, "County seat did that?" "Looks like." Peter looked toward the road. Neither man said Dorothy's name. The first cattle car was nearly full when Peter stopped again. "Clark!" Clark turned. Peter nodded toward the far end of the platform. Dorothy stood there. Dust covered her skirt. Her hat was tied against her back. The leather bag hung from one hand. Clark did not move at first. All morning he had trained himself not to look toward the road. Now he couldn't look anywhere else. Dorothy waited. Clark handed his rope to Peter. Then he walked toward her. People moved between them. A railroad worker rolled a gate shut. Steam drifted across the platform and cleared again. Clark stopped several feet away. His eyes went to the bag. Then her face. "You could have gone." Dorothy held his gaze. "I did." Clark frowned. She set the bag down and opened it. From inside, she took the agreement he had prepared at Cedar Bluff. "You gave me a road out." Clark looked at the folded paper. "I meant to. I needed to know it was real." It was. Good. The word was almost lost beneath the cattle and the locomotive. Dorothy stepped closer. "Because I spent too many years under roofs where staying was the price of having one." Clark said nothing. "You didn't make Cedar Bluff another one." She placed the agreement in his hand. "Then staying is mine to choose." Clark looked down at the paper. For a moment, Dorothy thought he might tear it. Instead, he folded it carefully along the crease. Then he held it back to her. "Keep it." Dorothy did not take it immediately. "Why?" "I never want you wondering." Her fingers closed around the paper. Clark's hand remained there 1 second longer. Then he let go. Dorothy looked toward the cattle cars. Judge Price kept the original books. Clark's eyes sharpened. "You found them?" He ordered them produced. Enough figures were changed to keep the inquiry open. The debt is disputed. Earl and Milton can't touch the records now. Clark glanced toward the telegram in his shirt pocket. "You did that." 2 other ranchers brought their receipts. You found them. They chose to come. Clark nodded. That mattered to Dorothy. He understood the difference. A gate slammed behind them. Peter called for Clark. Clark looked over his shoulder, then back at Dorothy. I have cattle to load. I can see that. A pause. You staying? Dorothy lifted one eyebrow. I thought we settled that. Something changed in Clark's face. Not the guarded, almost smile she had seen during summer. This one stayed. Small, real. I'll be done before dark. I'll wait. Months later, when winter settled over Cedar Bluff, nobody could have called the ranch wealthy. They kept the breeding stock. They paid the hands. They repaired the North Corral before the first deep snow. And when spring came, Cedar Bluff began the year without taking another loan. That was enough. The county inquiry continued through winter. Dorothy answered questions when required and supplied her copies. Earl Whitaker no longer controlled the records. Milton Graves stopped buying distressed cattle around Granite Hollow while the accounts were under examination. Dorothy did not spend the winter becoming only Mrs. Benton. Every Tuesday, weather permitting, she rode into Granite Hollow. Louise Harper cleared a small rear room in the general store. Clark built a shelf along one wall. Dorothy found him measuring it one evening. You know I can reach an ordinary shelf. I know. Then why are you measuring? Clark marked the board with his pencil. Because the ledgers fit better this way. Dorothy smiled and let him continue. By March, a simple painted sign hung in Louise's store. D. Freeman Benton accounts and livestock records. Ranchers who once ignored her tally sheet now brought receipts folded into coat pockets. Dorothy charged for her work. She kept her own records. Clark never asked what she earned. One evening in early spring, Dorothy returned from town as the last light faded behind the foothills. Snow remained in thin white lines along the north side of the pasture, but the air smelled of wet soil. Clark sat on the porch repairing a harness. Dorothy went inside and closed the ledger she had left on the kitchen table. Beside the door, two keys hung from the same nail. The front door, the ranch office. She took both. Clark heard them. Going somewhere? Town in the morning. He nodded. Road should be dry. That was all. No question about when she would return. No question about who she would see. Dorothy slipped the keys into her pocket and sat in the chair beside him. Clark continued pulling waxed thread through the harness leather. The pasture slowly disappeared into darkness. Dorothy could hear dry Willow Creek beyond the cottonwoods. A year earlier, Clark Benton had believed the safest marriage was one without love. Dorothy Freeman had believed the safest life was one with a road always open behind her. Neither had been entirely wrong. They had simply mistaken safety for living. Clark never needed Dorothy to surrender the road. Dorothy never needed him to promise the world beyond Cedar Bluff would stop being uncertain. He gave her the right to leave. She gave him something no agreement could guarantee. She stayed. The two keys remained in her pocket, and Clark never asked for either one back. Maybe that was the truest thing they ever gave each other. Clark had spent years believing that if he kept love out of his life, he could keep loss out with it. Dorothy had spent just as long making sure no roof, no marriage, and no promise could take away her right to choose her own road. In the end, neither of them was rescued by the other. They simply became the kind of people who could stand beside someone without holding them captive. Out there beneath the Wyoming sky, Cedar Bluff remained what it had always been. A working ranch with fences to mend, cattle to count, winters to survive, and bills that still had to be paid. But now there were two chairs on the porch, two keys in Dorothy's pocket, and two people who understood that staying means more when leaving is still possible. Clark's strength was never really in his shoulders. It was in opening his hand when every old wound told him to close it. And Dorothy's courage wasn't proven by staying. It was proven because she could leave, did leave, and came back by her own choice. Maybe that's worth remembering in our own lives. The people who truly love us don't have to close every door behind us. Sometimes they simply make home a place we freely choose to return to. What would you have done if you were Dorothy? And if stories about dignity, second chances, quiet courage, and love earned the hard way still mean something to you, subscribe and stay with us. There are more roads across the West still waiting to be traveled, and more stories waiting at the end of them.